Ladies and gentlemen, imagine for a moment that two nations, separated by geography, culture, and history, yet bound by a common thread of resilience, were able to send shockwaves across the global economy. Imagine that the humble cotton plant, often overlooked in modern conversations dominated by technology, artificial intelligence, or renewable energy, suddenly became the epicenter of one of the most significant disruptions in the international marketplace in recent memory. This is not speculation, nor is it the work of fiction. This is the unfolding reality of what analysts and observers are now calling the Cotton Rebellion, led by two unlikely champions: Burkina Faso, a landlocked country in West Africa, and Bangladesh, the bustling South Asian nation whose textile mills hum day and night, producing garments for nearly every corner of the globe. Together, these nations have turned cotton into a weapon of sovereignty, a tool of economic liberation, and a lever capable of shaking even the most entrenched pillars of the world economy. To understand the magnitude of this rebellion, we must first look back at the story of cotton itself. Cotton has been central to the development of the global economy for centuries. It fueled the Industrial Revolution, built empires, and connected continents. From the plantations of the American South to the mills of Lancashire, from the fields of Egypt to the looms of India, cotton was both a commodity and a currency, both a crop and a cause of struggle. Its fibers carried with them not just threads for clothing, but the threads of human history. Threads that stitch together prosperity for some and oppression for others. Today, even as we wear shirts made of synthetic blends and discuss sustainable fabrics, cotton remains one of the world's most vital crops, feeding industries worth hundreds of billions of dollars annually. And yet, for far too long, the producers of this crop have remained at the mercy of global markets, dictated by multinational corporations, trading houses, and financial institutions headquartered far from the dusty fields where cotton is actually grown. Burkina Faso is one of the largest cotton producers in Africa. Known as white gold, cotton represents nearly half of the country's export earnings. For decades, farmers in Burkina Faso worked tirelessly under the sun, producing millions of tons of high-quality cotton, yet reaped little of its true value. International buyers and foreign textile giants set the prices, often aided by the subsidies given to farmers in wealthier nations. African cotton could never compete fairly against the heavily subsidized crops of the United States or Europe. The result was predictable: poverty for the growers, wealth for the traders, and dependence for entire nations. For the people of Burkina Faso, cotton was both a blessing and a curse. It sustained their livelihoods, but shackled their economy. Bangladesh, on the other hand, is not a cotton producer of significance, but rather one of the world's largest consumers of cotton, importing millions of bales every year to feed its colossal garment industry. The ready-made garment sector in Bangladesh is the backbone of its economy, employing millions, especially women, and exporting clothing worth more than $40 billion annually. Walk into a store in New York, London, or Paris, and the chances are high that the label on your shirt reads, "Made in Bangladesh." But Bangladesh has long been trapped in a cycle of dependency as well. Dependent on imported cotton, vulnerable to global price swings, and beholden to the demands of Western brands that dictate prices and working conditions. Despite being a powerhouse of textiles, Bangladesh historically lacked the leverage to challenge the system. And yet, in recent years, something remarkable began to unfold. Burkina Faso, under new leadership, started to rethink its role in the cotton industry. No longer content to be a supplier of raw materials, it began exploring ways to process more of its cotton domestically, adding value before export. This meant investing in local spinning mills, textile factories, and industrial capacity. It meant cutting back on dependence on Western intermediaries and looking instead toward regional alliances and partnerships with nations like China, Turkey, and Russia, who were more willing to invest without imposing the usual political strings. At the same time, Bangladesh began to look for more reliable and fairer sources of cotton. Tired of being squeezed by volatile global prices and geopolitical tensions affecting its supply chains, Dhaka turned its eyes to Africa. There, it found a partner in Burkina Faso. The idea was simple yet revolutionary. What if the producer and the consumer, the grower and the manufacturer, could bypass the traditional middlemen of the global market and strike direct deals? What if African cotton could be shipped straight to Asian mills, creating a South-South partnership that cut out the dominance of Western trading houses and the financial leverage of global institutions? This was the birth of what is now being called the Cotton Rebellion. Burkina Faso and Bangladesh, each from their own angle of vulnerability, decided to flip the script. For Burkina Faso, this meant asserting control over its cotton exports, demanding fairer prices, and refusing to sell at rates that impoverished its farmers. For Bangladesh, it meant supporting this stance, even if it meant paying slightly more in the short term, because in return, it gained reliability, solidarity, and freedom from the chokehold of Western supply chains. Together, they began setting terms instead of accepting them. The effects were immediate and dramatic. Global cotton markets thrive on predictability, on the assumption that African producers will always sell cheap and that Asian manufacturers will always be desperate for raw materials. When Burkina Faso withheld supply and began negotiating directly with Bangladesh, prices spiked. Traders in London and New York were caught off guard. Futures markets wobbled. Multinational retailers, already strained by inflation and supply chain disruptions, suddenly faced the possibility of higher input costs. Some warned of rising clothing prices for consumers in the West, a development that would ripple through the entire retail sector. But beyond economics, the Cotton Rebellion carried symbolism that was perhaps even more powerful. It signaled that nations long relegated to the margins of the global system were no longer willing to play their assigned roles. Here were two countries, often dismissed as weak, poor, and dependent, daring to rewrite the rules of trade. Their cooperation embodied a new spirit of South-South solidarity, one that sought to bypass the historical hierarchies of North and South, rich and poor, lender and borrower. In doing so, they inspired conversations in other parts of the developing world. Could cocoa producers in West Africa band together to dictate terms to chocolate companies in Europe? Could coffee growers in Latin America bypass the commodity exchanges and strike direct deals with Asian buyers? Could oil-rich nations in Africa or the Middle East use their resources not just as commodities, but as levers for restructuring global finance? Of course, the Cotton Rebellion was not without its critics and challenges. Western financial institutions warned that Burkina Faso risked isolation if it defied market norms. Analysts predicted that retailers might shift sourcing away from Bangladesh if costs rose too high. Some argued that the rebellion was unsustainable, that global supply chains were too entrenched, and that these nations would eventually be forced back into line. But others saw in these criticisms the very reason why the rebellion mattered. After all, every liberation struggle in history has been met with warnings, doubts, and threats. It is precisely by challenging the status quo that change begins. For Burkina Faso, the rebellion also had domestic consequences. By asserting sovereignty over cotton, the government sent a message of empowerment to its farmers. They were no longer pawns in a global game they could not see or control. They were partners in shaping the nation's destiny. For Bangladesh, the rebellion reinforced its image as not just a low-cost garment hub, but as a nation willing to stand with producers and workers across borders. It was a gamble, yes, but one that could redefine its long-term stability. Internationally, reactions were swift. China expressed interest in supporting the Burkina Faso-Bangladesh partnership, seeing in it an opportunity to expand its Belt and Road vision into new domains. Russia, too, signaled support, framing the rebellion as part of the broader shift toward a multipolar world where the West no longer dictates terms unilaterally. Western nations, on the other hand, voiced concern. Some worried about inflationary pressures. Others worried about the precedent it set. If Burkina Faso and Bangladesh could defy the system, what would stop others from doing the same? What if this spirit of rebellion spread to other commodities, destabilizing markets built on predictability? The Cotton Rebellion also intersected with broader issues of climate change and sustainability. Cotton is a resource-intensive crop, requiring significant water and often pesticides. By asserting control over production, Burkina Faso opened the door to pushing for more sustainable practices. If producers were in charge, they could demand fairer prices that allowed them to adopt environmentally friendly methods, rather than being trapped in a cycle of overproduction for survival. Bangladesh, too, could push for greener sourcing, aligning with global demand for sustainable fashion. Thus, the rebellion not only shook the economy, but also hinted at the possibility of a more just and sustainable industry. The symbolism of cotton cannot be overstated. It was once the crop that justified colonial conquest, slave labor, and industrial exploitation. Today, it is becoming the crop that symbolizes defiance, sovereignty, and solidarity. The story of the Cotton Rebellion is not just about fabric, it is about freedom. It is about nations once considered weak, reminding the world that they too have power. It is about turning a thread into a rope strong enough to pull down walls of dependency. As this rebellion unfolds, it forces us to ask uncomfortable questions. What happens when producers and consumers in the global South unite? What happens when they stop accepting the terms handed down from boardrooms in New York, Paris, or London? What happens when they dare to imagine a system built not on exploitation, but on fairness? The Cotton Rebellion may be just the beginning, but it has already shown that the world is changing. No longer can power be assumed to reside only in the North. No longer can the resources and labor of the South be taken for granted. Ladies and gentlemen, the Cotton Rebellion is not merely a story of trade. It is a story of courage, of vision, and of a willingness to defy centuries of economic hierarchy. Burkina Faso and Bangladesh have reminded us that history is not only written in the halls of parliaments or the offices of corporations. Sometimes it is written in the fields where farmers bend their backs to harvest cotton, and in the factories where workers stitch garments late into the night. Sometimes it is written by those who have the least, yet who dare to demand the most fundamental right of all, the right to fairness. As we watch this rebellion unfold, one thing is certain. The threads of cotton have once again become the threads of history. And as they weave together across continents, they are creating a fabric of resistance, a cloth of hope, and a garment of liberation that the world cannot ignore.